On April 9th, Chiron stations direct in Aries, and if you have been carrying something you cannot name, something old, something that resurfaces every time you think you have finally outrun it, what happens in the sky today is for you, not for everyone, for you specifically. Because what Chiron stationing direct in Aries activates is not a new wound, it is the original one, the one that was there before you knew how to defend yourself, the one that became the hidden architecture of everything that followed, every relationship, every decision, every version of yourself you constructed on top of it. And right now, in the days around April 9th, that wound is not quiet. It is not patient. It is doing something you have probably noticed but could not explain. It is rising up through your body with a pressure you have not felt in years, or perhaps decades. A pressure that does not announce itself as pain. It announces itself as urgency, as impatience, as a strange charged restlessness in your hands and your chest that has no clear object. You know something needs to happen. You do not know what. You only know that the person you were last year feels somehow both very recent and very far away. There is something specific I want to show you about why this is happening. Why this particular Chiron station, in this particular degree of Aries, is targeting something much older and much deeper than a transit usually reaches. I will explain it later in this video, but keep watching because what I am going to describe is not generic healing language. It is the specific mechanism by which the wound you have been managing your entire adult life is, right now, asking to finally be completed. Stay with me. Let us go slowly. This matters. Right now, thousands of people are watching this video in the same window of hours. People who woke up this morning with that same unnamed feeling, that same sense of something pressing from beneath the surface, something trying to come through. You are not alone in this. What you are experiencing is not personal dysfunction. It is a collective threshold. And the fact that you are here paying attention already tells me something about where you are in your own process. If what you are feeling today is landing for you, leave a comment below. Tell me, I am ready to stop carrying this. Because that sentence is not a wish, it is a declaration. And there is something powerful about naming it out loud, even in writing, even in a comment section, even here. Now, let us go deeper, because the real work begins now. In the days surrounding April 9th, you have likely been experiencing something that does not fit neatly into your normal emotional vocabulary. It is not sadness. It is not anxiety exactly, though it has the texture of both. It lives somewhere between the two, a kind of ache that has a location in your body, usually somewhere in the chest or the solar plexus or the throat, and that intensifies at specific times of day, not always during the obviously stressful moments, more often during the quiet ones, during the 15 minutes after you wake but before the day starts, during the drive home when the music is on and you are not quite thinking about anything, during the pause between tasks when the noise falls away and something underneath the noise becomes briefly audible. That something underneath the noise, you have been hearing it more than usual, and you may have noticed that you do not quite know what to do with what you hear. Your sleep has been different, not necessarily worse, though for some of you it has been that too, different in quality. There is a heaviness to it that was not there 2 months ago. You may be dreaming more than usual, or dreaming in a way that leaves residue, not nightmares but emotionally textured dreams that you cannot quite remember and cannot quite shake. You wake and the dream is already dissolving, but the feeling it carried is still in your body, like a note held past the end of the song. And you move through the first hour of the morning with that feeling sitting in you, coloring everything slightly before the day takes over and drowns it out. This is not a malfunction. Your nervous system is doing something deliberate. It is surfacing material that your waking mind has learned, very skillfully, not to look at directly. The people in your life have felt slightly different to you lately. Not because they have changed, though some of your relationships do feel right now like they are under a kind of low-grade pressure you cannot quite locate the source of. It is more that your threshold has shifted. Things that you absorbed easily before are now producing friction. Small moments of not being heard. Small moments of giving without receiving. Small moments where you smile and agree, and internally feel a flicker of something you quickly move past. That flicker has been harder to move past in the last few weeks. It lingers a few seconds longer. It leaves a faint taste. This is significant. Pay attention to the flicker. It is information. You have also been experiencing a particular quality of cognitive restlessness, a circling in your thoughts, a return to certain unresolved questions that you have been returning to for years and that have not, despite everything, produced resolution. Not because you are stuck, though it can feel that way, but because the question has always been slightly wrong. You have been asking the wrong version of it, and something in you knows this, even if you cannot yet identify what the right version is. Some of you have been experiencing this as a heaviness around decisions, not inability to decide, more like a reluctance. Like the options available feel like they belong to an older version of your life and you are waiting, without knowing you are waiting, for a new option to appear. An option that comes from a different part of you than the one that has been making decisions until now. There is also something happening in the way you are relating to time, not a dramatic shift, something subtler than that. A growing awareness that certain chapters are genuinely behind you in a way they were not quite behind you a year ago. Not as loss, though sometimes it arrives as loss. More as a shift in your internal orientation toward your own life, a sense that the calculus has changed, that the questions that were right for an earlier decade are no longer quite the right questions, that something in your relationship with the future is asking to be renegotiated. You may have caught yourself recently, not quite able to imagine a future that is simply a continuation of the present, even when the present is good. The imagination is reaching for something it cannot yet fully see. That reaching is not dissatisfaction. It is Chiron. It is the wound beginning to ask its final question. Underneath all of this, underneath the restlessness, the altered sleep, the friction, the circling thoughts, the changed relationship with time, there is something that might be the most uncomfortable of all because it is the hardest to justify. A grief that is not attached to a specific loss. It arrived without an event. It does not have an obvious cause, which means you cannot explain it to anyone, which means you have been carrying it alone, which means it has been heavier than it needed to be. This grief is old, much older than the last few weeks. The current transit is not creating it. It is simply making it impossible to keep in the back of the room where you have kept it. For those of you who carry financial weight, who have been feeling the specific tension between what you know you are worth and what you have been willing to ask for, between what you have been giving and what you have been allowing yourself to receive, this grief has a particular texture. It is not just about money, it is about the story underneath the money. The story that says there is a version of abundance that is not available to you for a reason that you absorbed so young, you no longer remember absorbing it. That story is what Chiron is touching right now. Not the bank account, the story that built the bank account. All of these experiences, the body-level pressure, the altered sleep, the relational friction, the cognitive circling, the unnamed grief, the weight around what you are worth, they are all the same thing arriving through different doors. They are all the signal of a wound that has been under pressure for a long time, and that is right now asking to move. This is what Chiron stationing direct in Aries means for a person in your body, in your decade of life, carrying what you carry. Let me explain what is actually happening in the sky. Chiron is not a planet in the traditional sense, though we speak of it as one. It is a small body, a comet-asteroid hybrid, discovered in 1977, orbiting between Saturn and Uranus. That orbital position is significant. Saturn is the principle of structure, boundary, and earned form. Uranus is the principle of rupture, liberation, and sudden knowing. Chiron moves between them, the bridge between what holds us in form and what breaks form open. It carries the energy of both, which is why its effects are rarely comfortable and almost always profound. Its mythological name gives us the deepest clue. Chiron was the immortal centaur, wise healer, teacher to heroes, who received a wound that would not heal. An accidental wound, undeserved, inflicted by a poisoned arrow, and because he was immortal, he could not die of it. He had to carry it, and in carrying it, he became something that undamaged beings cannot become. A healer who knows from the inside what wounds do to a person. His very authority came from his wound, not despite it, because of it. This is the archetype. You do not need to believe in mythology for this to be true. Look at the people in your life who have most genuinely helped you in your hardest moments. Almost certainly, they were not people who had never suffered. They were people who had suffered, who had looked at it clearly, and who therefore could be present with yours without flinching. The wound worked with becomes the gift. Not automatically, not through passive suffering, through the specific work of turning toward it rather than maintaining the perfectly engineered management system around it. Chiron in Aries is operating at the level of identity. Aries is the first sign, the I am, the self that exists before relationship, before role, before reputation. Chiron in Aries wounds this, the fundamental sense of the right to exist fully, to take up space, to want without apology, to act from the core of what you are rather than from what you have calculated is acceptable. For most people with significant Chiron in Aries influence, the wound is not dramatic. It did not necessarily involve obvious violence or trauma. It was quieter than that. It was the accumulation of small moments very early in which the full-sized version of you was discouraged, gently, often with love, by people who were themselves wounded, until a smaller, more manageable version became the version you led with. And today, April 9th, Chiron is stationing direct. It has been retrograde since July. During retrograde periods, Chiron's energy moves inward. You feel the wound in interior ways, in dreams, in patterns of thought, in the quality of your private experience. When Chiron stations direct, when it pauses in its apparent backward motion and begins to move forward again, something shifts. The wound stops being an interior phenomenon and begins to move toward expression, toward reality, toward the decisions and conversations and choices that exist in the external world, rather than only in the interior one. This is the specific mechanism I wanted to show you. The pressure you have been feeling, the urgency, the restlessness, the sense that something needs to happen, is not anxiety without basis. It is the specific internal signature of Chiron preparing to move forward through material that has been held still for months. The wound is not worsening. It is mobilizing, and mobilizing is not the same as breaking apart. The central image I want you to hold for this entire transit is this: a splinter that has worked its way to the surface of the skin. When a splinter is embedded deep, you manage around it. You adjust the pressure of your hand. You protect the area. You accommodate the discomfort so skillfully that you almost forget it is there. But as it works toward the surface, as the body's intelligence begins to move it toward the place where it can finally be removed, the area becomes tender, more sensitive than it has been, more noticeable. What felt like management now feels like urgency. The splinter has not gotten worse, it has gotten close to out. This is exactly where you are on April 9th. Now, let us go into what this actually means for your life. Not abstractly. Inside. The work of a Chiron station is not comfortable from the inside, and I want to honor that before anything else. What is happening right now is not a gentle spiritual upgrade. It is more demanding than that. And for a person your age, someone who has spent decades building a life, building stability, building identity, what is currently under pressure is not just a belief or a habit. It is something closer to the foundation, which is why the feeling is so charged, which is why the restlessness has that particular urgency, which is why you may have found yourself in the last few weeks reacting to things with more intensity than seems proportionate, because what is being touched is not the surface. It is the structure underneath the surface. Something is cracking open, and I want to be very specific about what that means, because the phrase cracking open has become so overused in spiritual language that it has lost its precision. This is not the pleasant cracking open of a door you have been waiting to go through. This is the less romantic kind, the kind that feels from the inside more like fracture than invitation, the kind where the familiar container of yourself is becoming insufficient for what is growing inside it. Not because you are failing, because you have succeeded. Because the version of you that has been operating for the last decade or two is simply too small now for what has accumulated in you through all of that living. When a shell cracks, it is not the shell failing. It is the creature inside having grown beyond the shell's capacity to hold it. But from inside the shell, in the moment of cracking, that distinction is not immediately obvious. From inside the shell, it feels like something is breaking. The work of this transit is to hold both truths simultaneously. Something is breaking, and the breaking is the breaking open, not the breaking apart. These are different processes. They have different destinations. What is being cracked specifically? For most people under this Chiron station, it is the management system. The very sophisticated, very functional, very expensive management system you built around the original wound. The one that has allowed you to function, to succeed, to maintain relationships, to appear more whole than you sometimes felt. This system has served you. It was never pathological, it was adaptive. You built it because you had to, because the alternative, walking around with a visible, unmanaged wound, was not workable in the life you were living. The management system let you get things done. It let you love people. It let you build things. You should not be ashamed of it. But a management system is not the same as healing. And the distance between the two has, at this point in your life, become noticeable. Maybe you notice it as a specific exhaustion, the tiredness of maintaining a version of yourself that requires ongoing effort to sustain. Maybe you notice it in the moments when someone sees you more clearly than you are used to being seen, and you feel simultaneously moved and frightened. Maybe you notice it in the way certain desires, not small ones, the full-sized ones, the ones you have been editing for a very long time, have started to make noise again after years of quiet. The management system is cracking. Not because you have done something wrong, because you have done enough right that it is no longer the most intelligent response to your actual situation. What is rising up through the cracks is old. This is the thing I most want you to hear, because I think it is the thing that is most confusing about this transit. The material that is surfacing is not new. It is not a new problem. It is not the beginning of a new breakdown. It is old material, sometimes very old material, that has waited with extraordinary patience for a time in your life when you were strong enough, experienced enough, and self-aware enough to receive it without being dismantled by it. For many of you, what is rising has to do with a period of your life you thought you had processed, a loss that you mourned and then moved past, a version of yourself you set aside when you had to become something more functional. The desire you gave up on at some point, not with drama but with the quiet, realistic surrender of someone who has learned what the world allows and what it does not. That desire is rising again now, not as torture, as information, as evidence that the self who had that desire is still in there, still intact, and is wondering now at this age, with this much lived experience, whether the surrender was as necessary as it once seemed. This is not regression. I want to name that directly, because some of you will be afraid that the emergence of old material means you are going backward, that all the growth of the last decade is being erased, that you are returning to a version of yourself you worked very hard to evolve past. That is not what is happening. What is happening is more sophisticated than that. You are going back to retrieve something you had to leave behind in order to survive an earlier chapter. And you are going back now because you are, for the first time, actually ready to carry it forward. The old grief that surfaces during Chiron transits is not a sign that the wound is reopening. It is a sign that the wound is moving toward out. Now let us name the pattern, because this transit is not just surfacing the wound. It is surfacing the pattern the wound created, the one that has been running through your relational and professional life in slightly different forms for as long as you can remember. And for a person at your stage of life, naming this pattern is not an exercise in self-blame. It is an act of extraordinary self-awareness, because patterns do not become visible from inside them. They only become visible from a sufficient distance. And you have finally enough life behind you to see the full shape of it. For most people under this Chiron in Aries station, the pattern has some version of this structure, a suppression of the full-sized self in the service of connection. A habit, learned early and refined over decades, of making yourself slightly smaller, slightly less, slightly more acceptable. Not out of weakness, but out of a kind of love that got confused with self-erasure along the way. You gave more than you received and you called it generosity. You managed your desires downward and you called it maturity. You swallowed the thing you actually wanted to say and you called it wisdom. And in many cases, it was wisdom, or at least it was adaptive. You learned somewhere very early that the full-sized version of you created a particular kind of friction in your most important relationships, and so you learned to edit. The editing became so fluent that you largely stopped noticing you were doing it. The edited version became functionally the version, and the full-sized version, the one with the unmanaged desires and the unfiltered knowing and the appetite that has never fully been given permission. That version has been waiting very quietly, very patiently, in the room behind the edited one. Chiron stationing direct is the moment the door between those two rooms becomes, for the first time in a long time, genuinely passable. Notice where this pattern has shown up in your financial life. Because the Chiron in Aries wound in the realm of money is almost always about worth before it is about wealth. It shows up in the chronic underselling of your own value, in the discomfort of naming what you actually need financially, without immediately softening it. In the habit of making yourself more affordable, more available, more accommodating than is actually sustainable. And then feeling a slow resentment about it that you cannot quite justify because you told yourself you chose it freely. Notice the specific moments when you have priced yourself. What happened in your body in those moments? What the number felt like before you said it, whether you said the first number or a smaller one. That gap between the number that arose first and the number you actually said is the Chiron wound in the material realm. It is not a financial habit, it is a worth story that predates every financial decision you have ever made. Now let us speak about where you actually are right now. Not where you are going, not where you will be, where you are now, in this specific moment, in this specific transit, which is one of the least mapped territories in the entire interior life, the in-between. You are neither the person you were before this process began, nor the person you will be when it completes. And this position, not the wound itself, not the eventual healing, but the threshold between them, is the most disorienting place of all. Because the old way of being yourself is no longer fully available. The strategies that worked before are producing diminishing returns. The stories that gave the wound its particular shape are no longer entirely convincing. You see through them more than you used to, but the new way, but whatever is on the other side of this cracking, is not yet fully formed. You cannot see it clearly. You can sometimes sense it in the way you might sense a familiar room in the dark, not seeing the shapes but knowing where the furniture is. This in-between is the territory of this transit, and I want to honor how genuinely uncomfortable it is for a person at your stage of life to not know. Because by your age, you have earned the right to know. You have done the work, you have paid the price, you have accumulated the wisdom. And still, here in this particular place, the knowing is temporarily unavailable. And what replaces it is something that feels uncomfortably like the not knowing of a much younger self. The not knowing of someone who has not yet found solid ground. In your life right now, this in-between has a very specific texture. Your children, if you have them, are in different chapters of their lives now, needing you differently or not needing you in the old ways at all. Your career, if it has been a primary structure of identity, is either undergoing its own transformation or asking questions about sustainability that it did not use to ask. Your body. This is something I want to name directly, because the 45-plus body is often the place where the wound is most physically legible. Your body is changing in ways that are not always welcome and not always on your terms. Energies that were available before require more intention now. Things that recovered easily take more time. This is not decline. It is a recalibration toward the essential. But in the middle of the recalibration, it can feel like loss, and it is important to name it as loss before it can be named as anything else. And your relationships, the long ones, the ones you have built over decades, they are under a particular quality of pressure right now. Not necessarily crisis pressure, something quieter. A pressure that comes from both people having changed over a long time and the relationship's vocabulary not having quite kept up with the change. A pressure that comes from the edited self having been the version that shows up even in the most intimate places, and something in both of you knowing, without saying it directly, that the editing is becoming more visible than it used to be. There is also a particular quality of loneliness in this in-between that is worth naming carefully, because it is not the ordinary loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of being in transition, of being in the process of becoming someone who does not yet fully exist, while the person you were is no longer completely available either. The people who love you most love the version they know, and you are not quite that version anymore. You have not yet become the version that is coming, and the gap between them, this gap is where you are living right now in this transit. It has the texture of being slightly out of phase with everything around you, of conversations that almost land and then do not quite, of reaching for words to describe your experience and finding that the usual words are slightly wrong, that they belong to an earlier chapter of your understanding. You are not broken, you are mid-sentence. The sentence is not finished yet. This is Tuesday. This is your actual life, right now, in the middle of this transit. I am not describing a spiritual abstraction. I am describing what it is to be a person of your age and depth in the specific week that Chiron stations direct. But there is something underneath all of this, beginning to stabilize. It is not fully here yet, and I want to be careful not to rush you toward it, because arriving at first light before you have fully inhabited the dark is a way of skipping the most important part. But it is there. I can tell you that it is there. The splinter is moving toward the surface, and something in you, the part that prompted you to watch a 40-minute video on a Chiron station, the part that stayed through the difficult inventory of everything you have been carrying, that part knows the difference between a wound that is breaking you and a wound that is completing itself. You know the difference. You have known for some time that these experiences, as uncomfortable as they are, do not have the texture of breakdown. They have the texture of breakthrough, even though from inside they often feel identical. What is beginning? A decision that has felt impossible is starting to feel possible. Not certain, not comfortable, possible. You may have noticed this already. A moment in the last week or two when a particular choice that has been paralyzed became for a few seconds uncomplicated. When the weight of it lifted briefly and you saw it clearly, without all the reasons why not crowding around it. That moment of clarity, even if it closed again quickly, even if the reasons why not returned, was a signal. It was the new ground, briefly available, before the fog came back. A direction, not a destination, is becoming faintly perceptible. This is different from having a plan. A direction is more fundamental than a plan. It is more like a quality of orientation, a sense of which way is forward that does not depend on knowing exactly where forward leads. For the 45-plus person who has been navigating a major interior transition, the emergence of direction before destination is actually the correct sequence. It is the body's intelligence operating before the mind is ready to construct its narrative around it. And underneath the grief, something is beginning to feel slightly like relief. The relief of a truth that has waited a long time to be looked at directly. The relief of no longer having to maintain the particular fiction that the wound was completely resolved, that the editing was completely voluntary, that the managed version was the complete version. The grief and the relief are not opposites. They arrive together, which is how you know they are real. The splinter is almost out. This is what almost out feels like. Not the absence of pain. Actually, often more tender than when it was deep. But a different kind of tenderness. The tenderness of something that is finally in motion toward its own completion. Now let us talk about what you can actually do with all of this. Because Chiron direct is not a transit you observe from a distance. It is one you meet actively, or it moves through you passively and leaves you in the same place you began, slightly more tired. The practices I'm going to offer you are not spiritual hygiene. They are specific engagements designed for this exact moment, in the exact territory you are navigating. The first is what I would call the retrieval. There is a version of you that got left behind at a specific junction, not necessarily in childhood, though sometimes there, more often in early adulthood, or in the period when the demands of life became heaviest. A version of you that had a want, a direction, a way of being in the world that was set aside because the situation required something more manageable. Chiron direct is the moment when you are being asked, specifically, to go back and get that version. Not to become them again, but to bring forward what they carried that you have been living without. The practice: sit with a blank page. Not a journal prompt, a blank page. And write without editing the answer to this question: What did I want before I learned what was available to me? Not what I wanted after I adjusted. Before the adjustment, let what comes up be as large as it needs to be. Let it be embarrassing or impractical or too much. The size of what you write is information about the size of what has been compressed. You do not need to act on it immediately. You need to see it. The seeing is the practice. The resistance you will feel. The adjusted version of you will argue that revisiting old wants is self-indulgent, that you are at an age for realistic forward movement, not for old dreams. That is the management system arguing for its own preservation. Notice the argument right through it. The second practice is the renegotiation. This transit specifically targets the ways in which you have been undervaluing yourself in the material realm. Not just in money, though money is one of the clearest mirrors for this. Look at one specific place where your self-worth is currently reflected in an agreement, a price you charge, a role you accept, a boundary that is consistently not held, a dynamic in a relationship where the exchange is not equal, and you have been calling the imbalance generosity. Choose one. Just one. The practice is not to immediately change it, though eventually that is the point. The practice is to name in writing what the fair version of that agreement would look like. What would it look like if the full-sized version of you, not the edited version, set the terms? What number would you name if you named the first number that arose rather than the adjusted one? Write the fair version. Look at the gap between the fair version and the current version. The gap is not a failure. The gap is the amount of Chiron wound that is still operating in that area of your life. You cannot close a gap you cannot see. The resistance, it will feel arrogant to write what you are actually worth. It will feel like you are setting yourself up for disappointment. Notice both feelings, write through them. The arrogance is not arrogance, it is the unfamiliarity of the full-sized version. The third practice is the simplest and the hardest. I'm calling it the receiving. Chiron in Aries wounds at its deepest level, the capacity to receive care, to be seen in your wound without immediately reasserting competence, to accept help without transforming it immediately into an opportunity to help back, to be held without taking over the holding. This transit direct is asking you to practice receiving something, one thing specific and concrete, that you would normally deflect or immediately reciprocate. It does not have to be large. Someone offers to help. You say yes without qualifying it. Someone says something kind about you. You receive it. You do not minimize it. You do not immediately redirect it back to them. You do not say, but, or actually. You say thank you and you let it land. This practice will feel, the first time you do it cleanly, almost unbearably intimate. That intimacy is the indicator that you are doing it correctly. The wound tells you that receiving without deflection makes you vulnerable. The healing tells you that this particular vulnerability is precisely what you have been waiting decades to learn how to sustain. Now, let us speak briefly to the signs that Chiron direct in Aries is most specifically addressing, the placements where this transit lands with the most direct personal force. Aries, you are the primary recipient of everything I have described in this video, and you know it. This transit is not abstract for you. It is happening in your first house, your identity layer, your most fundamental sense of who you are in the world. The wound being surfaced for you is the original one. The wound to your right to be precisely and fully who you are, without apology, without editing, without the constant background calculation of whether the full-sized version of you is too much. You have been too much for someone once, and you carried that as a verdict instead of as information about the limits of that particular person. Chiron Direct is asking you to revisit that verdict, not to become reckless, to become whole. Libra, you are receiving this transit from your opposite. Chiron is in your 7th house, the house of partnership, contract, and mirror. The wound being surfaced for you is the one that lives specifically in your relationships. The specific way you have managed your needs downward in the service of keeping the peace, of maintaining the connection, of being the person in the relationship who holds it together through the practice of consistent, graceful self-minimization. Chiron Direct is asking you to name what you have been needing in your relationships that you have not asked for, not because you will necessarily get it, because you need to know that you know what it is. Cancer, Chiron in Aries, is forming a square to your natal sun. the aspect of productive, uncomfortable friction. For you, the wound being activated is the one that lives at the intersection of self and care. The way in which nurturing others has become such a practiced mode that your own needs have become legible to you only through other people's needs, as if the permission to want something for yourself requires someone else's want to justify it. Chiron Direct is asking you to practice wanting something specific for yourself, for no other reason than that you want it, without anyone else's need as the vehicle. You have stayed with me for nearly 40 minutes, and I want to acknowledge that directly, not as a retention metric, but as a genuine recognition of what it means for someone at your stage of life to give sustained attention to their own interior. You were not raised, most of you, in a culture that honored this. You were raised in a culture that measured value by productivity, by output, by what you produced for others. Sitting with yourself, paying careful attention to what is moving in your own interior. For 40 uninterrupted minutes. This is not passive. It is one of the most demanding and most undervalued practices available to a human being. You did it today. That matters. Here is where we have arrived. On April 9th, the sky pauses. Chiron holds still for a moment, at the degree where it has been working its way through your oldest wound, the one that was there before you had language for it, the one that became the silent architecture of so much that followed. And in that pause, something that has been moving inward for months begins very slowly to turn outward. The wound has not been healed in the way a wound heals when you simply leave it alone. It is healing in the only way that wounds like this actually heal, through the specific, demanding, intimate work of turning toward it with enough steadiness to finally see it clearly. The splinter is at the surface. You know what it is now, or you are closer to knowing than you were this morning. And the knowing, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it brings with it the grief of all the years of accommodation, the knowing is the beginning of the actual thing, not the management of the wound, the completion of it. If this video reached something in you today, leave a comment, tell me. The full-size version of me is allowed. Say it, because it is a declaration that belongs to this specific moment. Say it, because Chiron in Aries is asking precisely that of you, in exactly this season of your life. And if what I described today resonated, if something in this video stopped you in the way that only truth stops you, not because it is comfortable, but because it is accurate, subscribe. Because what I am building here is a space for people who are done with easy answers, who want the depth, who are willing to do the actual work of paying attention to what is genuinely moving in their lives. You did that today. Go gently with yourself tonight. You have looked at something real. Let it settle at whatever pace it needs to settle. Do not rush toward the resolution. The resolution is coming. You have been doing the work that makes it possible, longer than you know, and more effectively than you give yourself credit for. The sky is turning, and so finally and precisely at the pace that is right for you, are you. Decline. It is a recalibration toward the essential. But in the middle of the recalibration, it can feel like loss, and it is important to name it as loss before it can be named as anything else. And your relationships, the long ones, the ones you have built over decades, they are under a particular quality of pressure right now. Not necessarily crisis pressure, something quieter. A pressure that comes from both people having changed over a long time and the relationship's vocabulary not having quite kept up with the change. A pressure that comes from the edited self having been the version that shows up even in the most intimate places, and something in both of you knowing, without saying it directly, that the editing is becoming more visible than it used to be. There is also a particular quality of loneliness in this in-between that is worth naming carefully, because it is not the ordinary loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of being in transition, of being in the process of becoming someone who does not yet fully exist, while the person you were is no longer completely available either. The people who love you most love the version they know, and you are not quite that version anymore. You have not yet become the version that is coming, and the gap between them, this gap is where you are living right now, in this transit. It has the texture of being slightly out of phase with everything around you, of conversations that almost land and then do not quite, of reaching for words to describe your experience and finding that the usual words are slightly wrong, that they belong to an earlier chapter of your understanding. You are not broken, you are mid-sentence. The sentence is not finished yet. This is Tuesday. This is your actual life, right now, in the middle of this transit. I am not describing a spiritual abstraction. I am describing what it is to be a person of your age and depth in the specific week that Chiron stations direct. But there is something underneath all of this, beginning to stabilize. It is not fully here yet, and I want to be careful not to rush you toward it, because arriving at first light before you have fully inhabited the dark is a way of skipping the most important part. But it is there.